Welcome to the NZIIA Podcast. Here we talk all things international, from trade to geopolitics to diplomacy. The NZIIA seeks to encourage an understanding of the importance of global affairs to the political and economic well-being of New Zealand, as in this interconnected age, what happens beyond these shores affects us all at home.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the NZIIA Podcast, brought to you by the Youth Panel. Today, I'm joined with Lachie Scott from the Youth Panel and James and Helen, the two execs of the Wargaming Society. How's everyone going today?
Very good, thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to have the chance to come on and have
absolutely.
a chat.
Thanks for having us.
Great to have you guys on. Just thought we'd start with some introductions, so I thought we'd just go around and say, what are your guys' backgrounds at uni? What are you studying? What are your passions? And then that'll probably lead us into how the Wargaming Society got started.
Sweet. Kia ora. So my name is Lachie. I am a member of the NZIIA Youth Panel. This is my first appearance on this podcast, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we have. I am currently studying at Victoria University of Wellington, undertaking a Master of Strategic Studies program, and I am also part of the Wargame Society. So I suppose you could say that my interests align with strategy, security, particularly in a New Zealand context, but I'm still learning where my exact field of interest lies.
I'm Helen. I finished my MSS in February, which was great to get over and done with. I'm interested in security, but a lot of it to do with human security and human cost when it comes to international issues. And I'm now working at MB, which is very cool.
Kia ora. My name is James Hurley. I have a master's degree in strategic studies as well, and I'm hopefully going to be starting my PhD in this coming trimester, where I'm going to be using wargaming as my research methodology to generate a new data set analyzing regional security, specifically cybersecurity in the Asia-Pacific. Main areas of interest are regional security policies in the Asia-Pacific, comparison between Singapore and New Zealand, focusing on small state theory as a framework for assessing how states in that region tend to interact when bumping up against larger sort of established status quo powers like the US or the UK or the PLC.
Awesome. One day we will have somebody on the podcast that didn't do the MSS, but it is not today.
It is not.
And maybe that is a little plug for the MSS. If you want to be on a podcast talking about things you're interested in, take the MSS. It's clearly the best postgraduate degree at university. But anyway, you guys all touched on things like security, international relations. Obviously, we're at the NZIIA. So why in university and postgrad in the MSS, why was something like the Wargaming Society needed? Why did it come into being? And why was it not there in the first place?
So it started after we had taken an analytic tradecraft course first semester last year during lockdown. So we were all in the same course, learning about different types of techniques to consider security and strategy. And we came across wargaming, which isn't hugely prevalent in the New Zealand international strategy space. And there were a few people in the class who kind of thought, hey, this is a Wargaming Society sized hole in the New Zealand international strategy area. And we can do that because we've all got the skill set and the knowledge of how to do some of this stuff.
Just to add on to that, I suppose the answer to why something like this hasn't existed before is that, well, it actually has. So there have been a couple of iterations of the Wargaming Society, specifically at Vic, in the years leading up to us finally starting it. But being a postgraduate society based around one particular postgraduate paper for a postgraduate degree, which normally ends in 1 to 2 years, depending on whether or not you're doing it full time, everyone just eventually winds up either graduating from uni and getting real jobs, or the interest goes away after they finish the paper. So we've tried to attack it a little bit differently by actually using our strategic studies degrees to plan things out strategically and ensure that we're actually operating the society in a sustainable way that actually will allow it to stick around and have some longevity and continue to be useful both to us and successive generations of budding strategists at Victoria.
Being part of the Wargame Society, whenever I tell someone that I wargame in my spare time, the one question that I always get asked is, oh, wargaming, like Dungeons and Dragons, right? So I have coincidentally just got back from designing my first Dungeons and Dragons character, but that's neither here or there. So could you please give us a brief rundown on exactly what wargaming is and how it differs from recreational role-playing?
The short answer is that it's actually exactly like Dungeons and Dragons, except afterwards you get to write a report. So the slightly longer form answer is that a lot of the concepts are the same, right? So you're devising mechanics and the actual game-like stuff. So how your character moves around, what kind of abilities they have, how they interact with the world around them, or how a group of characters or gestalt character that's supposed to stand in for an actor, for instance. And from there, you apply that to a scenario. So for Dungeons and Dragons, it's whatever world your characters are inhabiting. With an analytical wargame, it might be a particular area of the world or a particular country or even a particular area within a country or even something a lot broader. Basically anything in between. There are lots of different levels of analysis that you can attack it from. But the main difference between a recreational wargame and the kind of stuff that we do is a mixture of methodology and intent. So you might design a wargame to teach someone something or to reinforce knowledge they already have. So you can design both the fluff and the crunch, as it were, around making sure that those concepts are emphasized and getting the players or the participants to interact with them in a meaningful way that gets them to actually operationalize their knowledge of those concepts. Or you can devise them to be an analytical game. So you're actually taking a given scenario designed to test certain questions that you have, and then from there, just see where the gameplay takes things. So it can be a way of scanning potential futures or testing hypotheses that are grounded in theory. And then after all of that, you get to write a report about what you learned.
Cool. So that was a really interesting breakdown of what a wargame is. Do you reckon you could give us a brief description of a wargame that the Society has run this year, the purpose behind it, and what lessons were learned from it?
Yeah, we might actually mention two of them because we've had a couple of quite different ones. So the first one that we ran this year was called Operation Emperor Penguin, and it was basically Alternative Futures Matrix game.
So a Matrix game is a war game that's based around argumentation. Rather than having counters and set values for things, you're not putting a set number of diplomacy points in and getting a certain number of influence points out. So it takes place at the strategic level. So it's countries and on-state actors and businesses and things. And each team uses their turn to make an argument for what their actor would do based on their profile and their assessment of the situation. And then if it's deemed to be plausible, it's then entered as an action in the game.
So we had a scenario where the international environment in which New Zealand operates was changed a bit. So we didn't have the stability of international organisations existing, and we were bringing great power conflict directly into New Zealand's backyard down into Antarctica. So we're looking at, with a changed environment, is New Zealand's foreign policy really up to scratch to be able to deal with some of those issues that might arise? That was really a good chance as well to introduce some of the newer members to the club into what wargaming is, because we had a few who haven't done the class and people who are doing the class currently hadn't actually gone all the way through it. So it was a nice taster for us to kind of refresh our skills from when we were taking it, but also really bringing other people in, explaining what the wargame is and hoping to kind of keep them in the club. So that was the first one we did, and that was pretty effective, and we've got a massive report that was produced after that.
That's going to be live on our website at some point in the very near future. So the second game that we devised was actually our first game for an external sponsor. So we do internal games like Emperor Penguin, which actually came out of, I think you mentioned, Helen, the class that we all took together. But the second game was actually one where someone from outside the society came to us and asked us to devise something bespoke for them. So this trimester just passed. I've been tutoring a paper for international relations titled Cyber Power in IR. So it's being run by the venerable Kathy Downs, who's also, like Van, had some DoD experience. So she's aware of wargaming and how it can be quite useful as a pedagogical tool. And in particular, she's been quite interested for the last few years. She's been running this course in actually gamifying this report that was released by the UKDA, the UK Defence Academy. called The Great Cyber Game, which rather deceptively titled because it doesn't actually describe a game at all. It just uses the UK's great game metaphor to describe cyber in a pretty accessible way for just a really diverse set of audiences. So this would be given to people who are in the staff college there, but it'd also be given to ministers and other potential stakeholders whose jobs may or may not require some fluency with the main concepts in cyber. So she's slapped this down in front of us and said, right, can you turn this into a game? And we basically just said yes. So we spent the rest of the trimester devising a system based off the matrix format that we normally use. So we modified that system slightly to incorporate some more cyber-facing mechanics, like modeling the different kinds of cyber power that we've discussed in the course, working in information asymmetry so players can lie to each other, which isn't a thing in normal Matrix games. And that wound up producing some pretty rich and interesting gameplay. And we actually got to run it as part of the course for the last 4 weeks of the trimester. And later on, when the course gets run again next year, it's looking like we might actually be able to introduce it as an ongoing assessed piece. So that's quite exciting.
And so how does running war games both enrich the reports you get out, but also maybe in the people who participate? So in the way they might think about certain situations and how they might play out. Basically, what is the advantage of running war games in both those macro reports you get, but also within the individual? What do they get out of it?
One of the major things that it gives people is a chance to kind of challenge their assumptions. So a lot of the time you're doing an essay, you're reading the same stuff over and over again, really kind of embedding your knowledge of a particular topic. Whereas with a war game, you're kind of forced to think outside the box, think about actors or countries that you might not normally be considering at the forefront of your mind when you're writing the essays. So if you're normally thinking from a New Zealand individual perspective, suddenly if you have to think from a PRC government perspective, you're going to be considering different events in a very different way. And so it really helps you to understand the international system in a much more in-depth way, as well as just sort of challenging any of your ideas. So it will really help to find issues or stress test things a bit more than you might do just in a normal essay format.
That sounds very interesting. I know when I was in undergrad, it was very, very easy to accuse certain actors in the international arena of being irrational actors. So to use wargaming as a tool to challenge that and actually explore different frameworks of rationality sounds like it would be beneficial to just about anyone, regardless of what they're studying.
Yeah, so that takes us back to the cultivation of something that it's been called strategic empathy in a couple of papers that I've read, but basically being able to put yourself in the shoes of another actor in their own part of the strategic context that you both inhabit and assessing why they might actually be making the decisions they're making on a level that goes a bit beyond just, oh, well, they have different values to us and we don't understand, but we can interpret, I suppose. So with a war game, you actually are in their shoes and you are having to make decisions that you might not necessarily agree with, but make sense for the actor as you have been modeling them. So I really liked how you brought up the irrational actors, because I think the name that's on everyone's tongues is the DPRK. And Team DPRK for the cyber game actually had to grapple with this quite a lot over the course of play, because there were a few people who would be chiming in constantly, almost saying, well, you know, it doesn't really matter what we do. With the DPRK, we act a little bit crazy. But no, when you look a little bit deeper and you examine the methodologies behind, for example, the deterrent strategy, behind the nuclear strategy, and also the external narratives about the DPRK and how it sort of benefits certain actors or certain news outlets and so on, to describe them in a very sensationalized way for clicks or whatever else. You start to get into the actual learning moments. You get people out of their comfort zones and you get them to start actually using the ideas from the course in a meaningful way that challenges their preconceptions.
That's fantastic. Just going back to Operation Emperor Penguin and Operation Tui, first I have to ask, why the bird names? That seems to be a common theme.
Yeah, so over lockdown, my partner and I got really into bird watching, like Zealandia memberships, got a camera about this long, everything. And it just seems like a really nice way to tie our operation, making war games, into the New Zealand context. It's something that ties us very closely to the culture, ties us very closely to local organizations here. People love the bird motifs in general across a lot of different businesses and contexts here. So it seemed like a very nice way to inject some Kiwiana into our day-to-day operations and remind us what sort of work we want to be doing.
And that extends to the logo, doesn't it?
Yes. So we have a Pietkiewicz, a New Zealand fantail. So that was actually Michael Gardner, our treasurer, his idea, because he was looking at the collective nouns for different New Zealand birds and came across the fantails collective noun. The name for a group of fantails is a war party.
It was meant to be.
Yes, it was absolutely meant to be. So it's now our logo. We've renamed the group chat to the war party. It's all happening. We are the bird club. And so Emperor Penguin obviously makes a lot of sense because set on Antarctica. Tui, I think we picked because they make dial-up noises.
Pretty high tech.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Returning to like New Zealand culture and the Wargaming Society, what is the place of wargaming in New Zealand in general? Before the Wargaming Society, is it common? Is it not really something that we do here? As you guys alluded to, both Van and Kathy have experience with it overseas in the DoD. So does that suggest that there isn't a lot of it here, and that's part of the reason why the society was established?
It kind of has and hasn't existed. For the most part, the really established wargaming capacities in New Zealand within government agencies, so MOD, NZIIA in particular, so on. It tends to be operational and tactical level, so specific training exercises, practical exercises. Civil defense also has a few different exercises that they run for disaster response teams and a few other disaster response outfits like Hut Rescue, and actually Victoria has its own search and rescue outfit going on as well. So they run exercises as well that you could definitely classify as war games. But stuff at the strategic level and stuff dealing with foreign policy, stuff that isn't military, essentially doesn't really see as much play here. So while Van and Kathy definitely have more experience with that side of things from their time in the States, for the most part, it's sort of only been discussed within an academic context. We are teaching the strategic tradecraft course kind of domain. It's always in the abstract, always in the hypothetical. It's never something that actually gets seen being applied in New Zealand in the same way it does in the States.
Yeah, even though it's actually a really great way to kind of bridge the gap between theory and actual applications, because it's a really good way to kind of think about all of the complexities that exist in actual everyday life. Theory's such a basic viewpoint of it, whereas in real life you've got so many different actors, the fog of war, and so it's actually a really useful analytical tool to use in any job that you're thinking about, a strategy, future, anything.
I'd like to return to Emperor Penguin again, if I may. Being a participant in that was a lot of fun for my very first war game. What were the lessons learned briefly? I know this is covered extensively in the report, but just for our listeners, New Zealand strategy, how did it hold up in great power competition in Antarctica?
So just to recap, the guts of Emperor Penguin's strategy was that it was designed to stress test New Zealand's hedging strategy amidst great power competition within a scenario that removed the sort of comfortable strategic distance it's able to maintain from the wider Asia-Pacific region. New Zealand, it's very far away from just about everything else. So conflict in even the South Pacific is still far enough away that New Zealand definitely needs to be cognizant of it, but it can sort of dictate its level of involvement. So the hypothetical that we proposed in Emperor Penguin is, okay, what if these great powers are suddenly really, really interested in Antarctica? Where does that leave New Zealand? How is it going to hedge when it actually has much more skin in the game than it's used to having? So as far as insights go, Helen?
For insights, we really found that maybe the hedging strategy isn't the best if we do have that kind of conflictual situation right on our doorstep. It really kind of showed that we might be pressured a lot from both sides or all directions to actually make a hard and fast decision rather than kind of saying, oh, I don't know, we'll just be friends with everyone.
It should be noted that one of the limitations of war games as a methodology is that they're not predictive. They're a way of scanning out potential futures, different ways that things might go given a certain scenario. But because they change from wargame to wargame, even if you replicate them in the same way you'd replicate a study, even if you've designed it to be one, it's still not necessarily going to produce all the same results. So you should never take them as predictive. But what we did see in Emperor Penguin is that New Zealand tried to do as little of anything as possible and just try to make nice with both the states and the PRC. But as a result, gradually it lost agency over the course of successive turns, meaning that by the end of the game, they basically had no actual options in their toolkit to exercise because the great powers have basically just taken over and were running the show.
Which is a bit of a problem when we think of New Zealand's independent foreign policy. Might be a little bit of an issue if we don't actually have that space to kind of do our own thing a little bit.
And there was a very interesting element of gameplay that emerged as a bit of a challenge. So would you mind just taking us through the actor-player distinction as a mechanic of wargaming and the problems of potential metagaming?
So with the war games that we've been running, there's different groups who act as if they are countries. So we had New Zealand, the PRC, Australia, and the United States. And basically one group will make a turn and then the rest of them will judge to see if they think it is a plausible event. They don't have to like it. They just have to think that it could happen. And so one of the issues that we came across was a bit of deception where...
It was a false flag terror operation.
Yeah. So it turned into a bit of an issue because every player in the room knew what had happened, that there had been a false judgment made about who had been committing the act. But as the countries, they didn't know. And so everyone in the room has to act as if they don't know a really important piece of information, which was something we weren't expecting, was something that we had to really kind of on the fly figure out how to deal with.
But the facilitators for that game, Michael and Ryan, did a really good job of rolling with that particular set of punches and managed to, on the fly, make sure that everyone was briefed on the distinction between actor and player knowledge, and we proceeded from there pretty effectively. And it also wound up giving them material for a really sticky wild card later in the game, which was nice.
So what's next for you guys at the Wargaming Society? What's your plan for 2021? Obviously, as we know, it's all new, but yeah, what's happening?
Well, the club's still quite young, and we're still trying to ensure that we have the foundations for that stability, that sustainability, that longevity. So we're essentially just trying to ensure that there's plenty of buy-in amongst the membership, that there's plenty of stuff to do, and that we're consistently turning out interesting, useful projects. So we're going to continue to be reaching out to external stakeholders and other ones within the university. We've already got the cyber game locked down, we hope, for a return next year. So that's something to look forward to for anyone who's looking at taking INTP 250 in 2021.
2022.
The times they are a-changin'. Beyond that, we're looking at instituting more different kinds of events. So we're going to be having more games nights where we just sit down and play a game and talk about it. So look at what sort of interesting mechanics are going on there and how it might be made into a better simulation or just a more interesting game, because there's wisdom that you can draw from just about anything that calls itself a game. There's a lot of crossover between the recreational and the analytical. So why not seek out that wisdom wherever you can find it?
Yeah, one of the other things we're looking at doing is running some war games that have been developed by other universities. So Georgetown University has a lot of wargaming stuff that they have, a really interesting one about Hong Kong. And the RAND Corporation in the States have a really big war game that we are considering running as well, just to sort of see how other people have done it, see what we can do to kind of improve what we've been up to and learn from people who have been doing this for a lot longer than we have.
Designing our own projects is definitely still going to be front and center of what we're doing, but there's no shortage of stuff that we can look at from other places and see what we can crib from them. So
just developing on that mention you made of designing your own ideas in the society, could you give our listeners a bit of an idea of some potential game scenarios that could come up in the future? I know there's an idea bank that exists. We don't have access to it right now, but off the top of your head, just for a little bit of listener interest, there's obviously been a game in Antarctica. There's been a cyber game. What are some other scenarios that the Society is thinking about examining?
There's one that we're developing at the moment based in Myanmar, which I don't know all that much about.
Neither of us are part of the Myanmar working group, so our ability to discuss that is rather limited, but we can say that the Society is designing a war game based around the current situation that's happening in Myanmar, looking at it from the strategic level, so looking at all the state actors that have an interest in the region and trying to game up potential futures for conflict resolution and what the wider effects on the region could wind up being. So that's going to be going along a much more traditional, basic Emperor Penguin style matrix format, possibly with a couple of extra levels that model in perhaps intra and extra state actors. So stand by for that, I suppose.
And I suppose that's the really cool thing about wargaming, is it can be applied to almost anything in terms of any scenario with any goal to come out of it. So how would you find the skills that you learn from wargaming being applied to things other than international relations based things? I suppose it's something that happens in the financial market quite a bit in terms of accounting and things like that. So what other applications do you see for wargaming in New Zealand, just in general, as a skill and as a thing that we can do going forward?
You're absolutely right pointing out the economic sector as a place where wargaming is currently used to a lot of effect. And some of the largest players in wargaming in general from like the 60s have been companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers or Shell, who is actually at the moment, I'm not sure if it's the Shell company themselves or something that's grown out of Shell and is now independent, but regardless of who it is specifically, they are currently working with groups within Myanmar to devise a game as part of a pre-negotiation process to game out possible alternate future resolutions to what's happening there and use that as an evidence gathering method to figure out which options can actually be on the table when the negotiations actually begin. But that's all very closed off at the moment because they just want to work with the stakeholders who are currently immediately going to be affected by the political situation there. So they're not really opening it up to everyone else.
Yeah, another type of wargaming is red teaming, where you basically act as the enemy of sorts. And so that's a really common one when it comes to cyber, trying to figure out any weaknesses in the system to make sure that you're prepared for any kind of incident that might take place. So that's done a lot in cyber, but it can really be done in many different ways. Think about what are all the things that could go wrong, and if they do, what would we do? How can we stop those from happening? So it's a pretty broad skill set. You know, it's not just matrix games, turn by turn, lots more options.
I suppose like a court battle is very similar, thinking about what the defendants might say or what the other side might say as well.
Actually, there's this, I'm going to do it. So earlier on, before the show, you were asking what, for example, a law student might find useful about a war game. Well, actually, going back to pirate times of the Caribbean variety, a common rite of passage or pastime on a lot of ships was setting up a mock trial where a person on the crew would be brought up in front of a jury and a judge and have to argue their case on a charge of piracy. So you would be there as a pirate having to convince your pirate judge and the pirate jury, everyone else, that you were not a pirate. So on top of being a fantastic way to pass time, it also gave all members of the crew experience standing up in a court setting and having to plead their case in a calm and measured and well-reasoned way. So it took the edge off in the event that they actually were captured and made to stand trial, but it also gave them experience with things like oratory skills. And that's something that's actually carried through till today in a bunch of different contemporary navies. So I think the US Navy has an ongoing mock trial club where they do this exact thing, but much more explicitly for the purposes of practicing public speaking skills and argumentation. And they bring in the services lawyers as well to get some experience with that.
Because wargaming definitely seems to bring a lot more of the human element into this, because as you said, it's a lot of discussion. And also what you said before about strategic empathy, understanding the perspective of the DPK, maybe understanding what are their strategic choices in a situation and not just kind of offhandedly, making assumptions about, well, they're irrational, or they're this, or they're that, and the combination of having to have your views challenged and talk them out and take the position of somebody you might not ever have to think along their lines, but at least understand where they're coming from, seems to really be something important when making a well-reasoned argument, whether that be in policy for anything or just in your own understanding of a situation, the complexity of the international environment.
Yeah, you're never just interacting with the normal methodology of you have your theory, you have your case study, you apply theory to case, and you have a discussion based on that. Just very basic university essay technique. Instead, you have a scenario and a system that you use to navigate it. So you've got essentially an entire alternate future or entire alternate Earth's volume of possibilities. And you can do basically anything that you want within reason. The tricky part is finding the reason. So one thing that wargames really have over that more traditional form of academic writing and thinking is that it forces people to negotiate with uncertainty and to actually get used to the idea that they're not going to know everything all of the time and still make decisions based on the information that they do have available. And I think that's why wargaming is currently having such a moment right now in New Zealand and across the world, just because we've been through COVID and you hear about this all the time when people are talking about futures casting, right? It was a black swan. Was COVID a black swan? Well, yeah. And getting used to interacting with uncertainty is one of those ways that's important for being able to deal with these unknown unknowns and these known unknowns and functioning when theory doesn't quite survive contact with oxygen.
Yeah, it helps you prepare for events rather than just being reactionary. You might have already considered it, thought about it at a time where it wasn't actually pressing, so you could think about it quite rationally. And so it really can prepare people to deal with some unnerving events because they've done some pre-planning for it.
You guys have given us a really fantastic and detailed both explanation and discussion of the benefits of wargaming from an academic perspective. What sort of challenges come in when you lose the detachment of academia and you have a stake, you have an interest suddenly involved? The case study that comes to mind for me is one of the more famous recent wargames. I believe it was Operation Millennium Challenge back in 2002, run by the US military. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it at all.
Maybe fill us in.
My understanding of it is Marine General Paul Van Riper was the red team, an unknown nation in the Persian Gulf, and he used incredibly unconventional tactics such as motorcycle messengers. He went super low tech. He used kamikaze boats, and he managed to wipe out the entire US fleet in 2 or 3 attacks very early on. And what was basically done was the fleet was refloated, he was removed, and they continued the game the way they wanted to play. And so that to me is emblematic of when you have interests and stakes involved that are on your head, does wargaming sort of become the sword that you fall on?
It definitely could be if you don't actually want to take the insights that you've learnt. So it can be a bit of an issue if someone says, oh, you're actually not good enough, but you've got a giant ego and you think that you're perfect. But if you are willing to learn from it, then you can definitely use it as a tool and it's not going to be your downfall. But I mean, that's just sort of us emphasising again that we think it's a great tool if you actually listen to it, do the report, consider what happened, really think hard about potential next steps or what you could do differently instead of just saying, well, I didn't like it, so we're just going to ignore it happened.
It's a thing you get in all sorts of methodology beyond wargaming as well, just the fudging of data in studies, for instance. So it becomes less a question of how is wargaming specifically going to protect against this, and more one of how do we just make sure that we are managing conflicts of interest in a way that allows us to turn out the best analysis that we can. And more importantly, the analysis is actually going to help and be useful to people. So if you're allowing things to confound those results, like people's egos getting in the way or people wanting to have a thumb on the scale for whatever other reason, then that's something that you need to be cognizant of in general, regardless of whether or not you're an academic.
Cool. So where can our listeners find you or hear about what's happening next? Where is the best place to get involved if they're keen or be a part of anything that you're doing going forward? So the Wargaming Society is open to general membership. We're taking on any and all comers, regardless of whether or not you have any interaction with the political sciences or international relations. If you are a creative writer
or you can deliver good prose if you take good notes, if you design experiments in the sciences, if you do graphic design. There's probably something for you to do at the Wargaming Society, because any types of skill that we can get on board is going to help make the types of analysis we're able to do and the types of exercise we're able to deliver more rich and interesting. So for sure, check us out, which you can do at our Facebook page. And we also have a website now. So W to the G to the SOC, Wargame Society, wgsoc.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming, guys. It was a really, really cool discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
It's been great. Thank you.
Just want to thank you guys for tuning in to our podcast episode. We'll be doing more discussions like this throughout the year. Follow us on our Instagram page, NZIIA to DM any questions you might have for our podcast episodes, and also to stay updated on upcoming roundtable events and other projects that we're working on this year. Cheers, guys.